Time for my afternoon panel. Liberal MP Katie Allen and Shadow Cabinet Secretary on the Labor side of politics, Jenny McAllister. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Hello, PK.
Let's start with you, Katie Allen. There is a debate around whether Australia should be pursuing eradication and suppression of coronavirus. In fact, I've spoken to a professor and former Greens leader who's also a sort of medical doctor today on the program, both arguing for eradication. Katie, I know you're in favour of suppression, so level with us. What does suppression look like? Are we going to continue to see these lockdowns? Is that just living with COVID-19? What does it look like practically for Australians?
Well, let me be clear. There's a difference between eradication and elimination. So aggressive suppression will lead to elimination, which means a low or zero case rate, while eradication means that while this global pandemic is raging around the world, and unless it either burns its way out naturally, as has done with previous SARS and MERS, or we have a vaccine, we actually can't defend ourselves completely from the rest of the world unless we completely disconnect. And that's both impractical and not likely to happen. So the most important thing is we had a plan at the start of this pandemic, and that plan was to aggressively suppress. And as you can see in other states and territories, it is extremely effective. Now, there's been a breakdown in service delivery here in Victoria, unfortunately, and that has resulted in a breakout here in Melbourne. So we do need to contain it with aggressive tracing and tracking and ensuring that the public comes with us with regards to physical distancing, hand hygiene and now masks. But at the end of the day, the most important thing is the plan worked at the start, it continues to work, and as long as service delivery with regards to quarantining continues, it is the right plan. It's an economically and sound plan from a health point of view.
Jenny McAllister, what's your view on this?
Katie say, I think that the differences between eradication, elimination and aggressive suppression are fine differences observed in the medical community. I'm not sure that the community quite understands the trajectory that we're on. I think it's really important that our leaders, particularly those leaders that are being regularly briefed by the health professionals, are talking to people about exactly what our goals are and how we're going to get there. We need to be listening to the health advice. There's no point people like me making it up. But I do think that we need to share as much as we can with the community about where we're going. We know that the community is capable of working together to protect one another, but that only happens if we take everybody into our trust. I think it's really important that there be very strong communication from the Prime Minister and all of the state premiers, particularly at this time.
Katie, if I can bring you back in, was it a mistake not to recommend the widespread wearing of face masks like earlier in the pandemic? There was this discussion about whether we should be wearing them. We kept getting told the health advice was not to wear them. Now apparently we must wear them in Melbourne. Was that a blunder?
No, not at all. In fact, I think that's the point. The last 4 months has been an excellent plan, and we haven't wasted anything really with regard to where we've got to. The breakdown has been in quarantining. In fact, with masks, I will say, I'm a little bit concerned about this step about mandatory masks in Melbourne, because I really hope we have the social licence to bring the community along. It's very important that when we have a public health recommendation that everybody does do it. And the point with masks is that when you have a very low prevalence in the general community, people will not necessarily use the mask correctly. They won't come along with us and do it in a very consistent way. Now, Australia tends to respond very reflexively to the US. They say that when America sneezes, we get a cold. And it is interesting, in the early aspects of this pandemic, masks were not recommended by the CDC, which is the expert committee in the US. Suddenly, we're doing it here in Victoria. I would argue that the most important thing we can do as a public is physical distancing and hand hygiene. If you cannot physically distance, then you should use a mask. And I think that's the important thing, rather than masks at every point. It's really when you can't physically distance. So we're in stage 3 lockdown, you have to stay at home. If you're going shopping and you're in close contact with other people, a mask is an extra precaution, but the physical distance is the most important precaution.
Of course, but just to pick you up on what you said, you're against this decision, are you saying, by the Andrews government to require people to wear masks?
Look, I believe as governments, we should all work together and stick together. So I will back in Premier Andrews' recommendation for mandatory masks. But I want the public to hear loud and clear that this is the third line of defence the public has to do. The first one is physical distancing. Second is hand hygiene. And the third is wearing a mask when you can't physically distance.
Well, you have to wear it though. It's not, I don't know if it's the third line, because legally it's the law.
He's decided to make it mandatory. I back him in on this. I personally wish that it wasn't mandatory for everything. Like you don't have to wear one when you run, but you do when you walk. But that being said, I'm not going to argue around the edges here. It is really important that we make sure that everyone comes on this journey, and if he believes that this important next step at this point, then that's fine. But it is important that we're all working together, and we are seeing the numbers starting to come down. The track and trace is probably the most important second step after quarantining, and that now has a good set of experts now. We've thrown everything at this situation to get it under control, and we need the public's trust to come on this journey as well.
Just briefly on the economic response, which is coming on Thursday, there are reports about a tapering down or a sort of more targeted approach to job seeker, job keeper. Clearly there's the next phase the government's moving to. Jenny McAllister, isn't that reasonable that you need a next phase? Clearly the government's not going to turn the tap off.
A couple of things there, Patricia. We have been arguing for a redesign of JobKeeper to make it more targeted for some time. We've been concerned that in some instances, some people were receiving significantly more through JobKeeper than they might have been under their ordinary conditions when they were working. But the key here is actually about giving some certainty. The government signalled for a very long time that they were going to turn the tap off in September. Now they seem to be indicating that they're going to do something else. There are millions of businesses and families dependent on this payment, and at the moment they have got absolutely no idea what's going on in September. And if you don't think that that's a drag on economic confidence and a drag on the economic circumstances of the country, you're kidding yourself. We need some certainty, and this has been a very long time in coming.
Katie, Thursday's sort of decision day, or at least telling us what the decision is. I'm sure many of them have already been made. But you are an MP in Victoria and Melbourne, where it's incredibly difficult at the moment. How important is it that the government keeps very generous supports in the economy, given the downturn we're seeing, particularly in your home state?
Look, I think it's pretty clear that everyone understands that this is a long-term game that we're playing. And I completely disagree with Jenny about not having certainty. The one thing the Prime Minister has said from the very start, he's been very clear that this is a long-term game. He said 6 months and then we'll review it. There are many world leaders that said it was going to be 2 weeks, that they were going to do lockdown and it would be all over in 2 weeks. He took the long game, which is we need certainty, and we need to be very careful in the decisions that we make. Now, he made a pretty dramatic decision to roll out JobKeeper and JobSeeker in a very quick period of time. I mean, these social supports have been rolled out in an amazingly short period of time. They've been highly effective, really well supported by the community. And I think there is general consensus that they have definitely helped to cushion the economic blow. Now, I personally believe that going forward, there are changes that we can make, and we will hear about those on Thursday. They need to be targeted, they need to be proportional, and they need to support those sectors that are doing it tough. And, you know, it's very hard to make decisions in a emerging and evolving global pandemic that has never been seen at this scale before in the modern world. So I think that we should really be, you know, very sort of secure that the certainty around the economic decisions are being very carefully considered. And Thursday will be an important day for Australia, but the next 6 months of economic decisions will be important decisions for the wealth and prosperity of Australia. And I think that we're heading in the right direction. We're listening broadly, and I really feel quite confident that the Australian public is happy with where we're being led.
Thank you to both of you. We will meet again. Liberal MP Katie Allen and Shadow Cabinet Secretary on the Labor side of politics, Jenny McAllister. And